And I'm going to serve as your moderator today. So please take a moment to drop your name and institution in the chat box so we know who's with us today. So today we're going to be hearing from someone that I know personally. Sometimes I don't know people that are presenting, but I do know Courtney. She's part of a Heartland Eden team that we have developed from the 4 states that we put together a few years ago through a NIFA grant. And so I know her fairly well, and she'll be a good presenter today. So her name is Dr. Courtney Long, and I'm going to read a little bit of her bio so you know who she is. She's a director of the Agricultural and Marketing Resource Center and manager of the Food Systems Program at Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. She's worked in food systems since 2010 and leads a dynamic food systems team with programming, research, and projects across the nation. Key areas of work include research and projects ranging from scenario planning for preparedness for future disasters, resilient food systems assessments, and placemaking through food system development. Much of her work connects to community and organizational assessment and facilitation to understand the underlying aspects of values and purpose in relation to resilience and food system intersections. Since 2024, Courtney has also supported efforts in Iowa for an extension-focused area, adaptive and sustainable natural and built environments, including a priority program for Iowa Eden. And like I say, she's one of the team leads for her Iowa team, but then she's also a part of the Heartland Eden team. So anyway, we welcome her today. Now, she's going to use the approach that if you have a question, you can either raise your hand or put it in the chat box, and we'll get to it as she has time to do that during her presentation. We're also going to put the evaluation survey link in the chat box, and we want to make sure that you fill that out. All of us know how important that is, and it has been very, very helpful um, that the foundation has been able to send those evaluations to presenters afterwards. They know then, how it went. They know how many, all the things that you need for a lot of your programming and for your reporting. It's being recorded today and will be emailed out and posted to Connect Extension under the Eden subgroup and the Eden YouTube within a day or two. And then the evaluation link will also be included in that. So in case anybody else didn't get to see this, you could pass it on, and we definitely encourage them to do the evaluation as well. So without any further ado, I think I've covered everything. I'm going to turn this over to Courtney, and I'm going to silence myself. Welcome, Courtney.
Awesome. Thanks, Connie. Hi, everybody. Courtney Long, as Connie mentioned, I am really excited to chat with y'all. I'm bummed that we're not in person and I can't see faces because I very much prefer a discussion and conversation. So please interject in the chat if you have comments or questions as I go through this, or raise your hand. I think that'll be more engaging. A little bit more background on myself, just in terms of the lens of how this resilient food systems process has begun. My background's in landscape architecture and community regional planning, and have looked at how food systems, natural disasters, and COVID were impacted as my doctoral research, and really excited to also have the opportunity to work with communities across the nation in understanding those impacts and opportunities for resilience, and take a very place-based and design-based approach to those processes. While I'm the only one presenting today, there's a dynamic team within Iowa State and Agmark that have supported this work. So happy to give them shout outs too as we go along. And all of our work is also based in communities. So we have different partners as well, farmers, food businesses, nonprofits, other land grants. So I'll try to share that too as we go. And again, realize there's experts on here. So if you have comments or things that you've seen, I really hope this can be an engaging space for all of us to share. So my goal for the webinar is to share about our resilient food systems framework that has been developed since about 2016. It's evolved from our community food systems program. So I'll share briefly about that, and then go into our methodology, some case study examples. We've worked specifically with 8 communities on this process, but we've used different tools in various ways with other projects too. So I'll highlight those things and then wrap up with some tools and resources, which many of you are familiar with because it's looking at tabletop exercises, scenarios, and foresight focus groups. So I'll share how we have evolved those for a specific food systems and farm lens. So first, the way we are describing resilient food systems is the capacity for a place and values-based food system and the actors within. So think about again those farmers or food businesses, processors, distributors, to be able to withstand shocks and disruptive pressures while maintaining basic structures, processes, and functions of and within the community food system. So this can include our supply chains, our food access and opportunities for all people, but again, ensuring the ability then that they're able to produce and access nutritious and culturally acceptable food over time and space and creating a new normality. Part of that language also came from not only trying to build back to where we were, but also transforming into a new resilient structure that may look different post disaster. What you see on this screen is our food systems framework. So this was developed at Iowa State Extension, but with partners who also have been engaged in either our local food leader or our community food systems certifications. So I wanted to share this because we spent some time thinking about how to describe food systems. So on the left-hand side, in the first ring is our food system sectors, or really these different components of what we're seeing across production to how the food meets our plate to how there might be food waste or composting, resource management. How we've described those are as cultivation and harvesting. So how we're caring for our land, how we're harvesting different products, what we're planting and growing. So this might be things like community gardens, different scales of farms, fishing and fisheries, those types of practices. We then look at transformation and processing. So how are we adding value to those raw products? What are the potentials, again, at various different scales for creating salsas or different products like a pie or like a restaurateur or those types of things. Um, think retail packaging, what you can find at the grocery store, those types of products. Next is aggregation and distribution. So how are we getting those products to our markets or to our individuals and businesses? So this would include things like our farmers markets, our food hubs, our distribution channels, and how we would look at the logistics of that transition. The next is purchasing and nourishment. So this is really including how and where we're eating our food. So the decisions that go into our purchasing choices, double up food bucks, SNAP, those types of practices, but could also include the restaurants that we're choosing to eat at and those types of things. And then last in the food system space is the conservation and stewardship. So this is really how we're caring for our land, water, soil, different practices for environmental sustainability. So this might be different programs that are supporting environmental sustainability, whether that be CRP programs, pollinator habitat, maybe it's looking at waste reduction, different programs for ocean conservation, water conservation, and those types of things. So that's the nested circle. The second broader circle is our community assets. So this language was developed from Community Capitals Framework and also informed by partners within our community food systems program to make it more relevant to the audiences we work with. So I'm just going to go like kind of top right around. So built infrastructure, we're looking at that. We're looking at buildings, roadways, all of the built environment aspects that would connect into both our food system and the community at large. Culture and wellness will tie more into our individual and faith-based systems, the culture practices that we might hold in our organizations, but also opportunities for personal wellness, and that can look different for everyone. Dignity and involvement is really encouraging and wanting to understand the opportunities that folks could have in decision making and being engaged in community organizations, in different policies, in activization of projects. So, how are we making sure that all individuals, businesses, cultures are represented in spaces we're working? Economy and finance, we're really trying to understand the economic impact of different programs. So that could be the economic impact of a farmer's market, of a natural disaster, of both positives and negatives in a community. But it could also mean for your individual or household the financial implications of certain decisions too. Governance and policy, that is focusing on city, state, organization, or federal policies or governance structures that might impact the work we're able to do or influence the decisions and ability for things to move forward. That could be policies that allow for funding to be implemented into a community, or perhaps changes that withdraw those types of resources, and what that means again for our food system implications. The next one is knowledge and wisdom. So this is looking at both informal and formal education practices. So that might be learning from grandparents, learning about our ancestry and history, but it could also be K through 12 education, webinars like this, and networks. And then last is our natural environment. So this really intersects with that conservation and stewardship space, but again, how we are caring for our natural spaces, what the potential protection needs are, and what those look like. So the goal there is just to understand the intersections of those spaces and how to create a more resilient space for our communities. The next image on this page is our process in a abstract design. So this is showcasing our phases of working in a community for resilient food systems. So the phase one is really taking that framework and doing many different factors to understand the goals of that place-based community. So first we would do visioning. That could look like developing a coalition, doing interviews, and really just understanding the goals of the community. We typically do a 5-year, 20-year, and 7-generation question to folks. So if you're thinking 7 generations from now, what do you want to see your community like 20 years from now, 5 years from now? We would aggregate those into goal statements and vision statements so then we know what we're working towards together. We're also completing research in that phase. So again, coming back to that framework, we would be doing interviews, gathering secondary data, focus groups, et cetera, to understand the intersections, the impacts, the challenges, the opportunities that folks see across that. We also host input sessions, which is based on those first 2 sections of visioning and research. We would do a poster charrette, if you will, where you would walk around a room, see all the opportunities, and choose what would be best for your community. And those are public intention. So we have more and more folks giving feedback into the space. And then last, we prioritize. So we can't do all things. So we typically prioritize some quick wins, intermediate and long-term projects. Phase 2 then moves into project implementation. So that's our food systems framework. If anything was confusing about that, please chime in the chat or raise your hand. I'm happy to go into more detail. But I wanted to share that as a foundation to now talking through how we've evolved that into a specific resilient food systems process. So now what you're seeing on the screen is this in a little more detail. So in our Resilient Food Systems program, we're still very community engaged. We would have a partner collaboration and work with those partners to conduct different stakeholder groups and those types of things. We still do the mixed methods research. So we typically conduct interviews through an appreciative inquiry style, host focus groups that are foresight focus groups with tabletop scenarios. I'm going to go into that in more detail here in a few minutes. We're collecting, again, that secondary data that gets analyzed and put into a snapshot and report. And then we're presenting those findings to a steering committee or a broader public input group to then prioritize an action plan related to preparedness strategies, response, recovery, or mitigation needs in the disaster emphasis. The other piece that we are really intentional about is there's one in this particular example that I'll be sharing. We choose a project that can be implemented. And for the last 4 years, we've had funding through the Agricultural Marketing Resource Center to implement a project. It has not been a boatload of dollars, but each of our 3 communities we've worked with received $22,500 to implement a program. So I'll also share how those have gone, and then we do an evaluation of that impact and success or challenges that occurred to better understand needs for the future. So I'm going to talk through really briefly these tools, and then I'll get into the case studies. So within our interview process, we're first really interested in how the business organization is set up, their understanding of community strengths and challenges, as well as their food system strengths. And that might be things related more to food access, or it could be agricultural production. It might be transportation issues, logistics. Perhaps we're working with a rural community and they don't have a grocery store. So we try to understand some of those dynamics. Following, we move into the disaster impact. So in interviews, we're asking specifically how their businesses, organization, their neighbors were impacted by a specific disaster. Let's say we're working on a flooding incident. We would ask about that impact, how they were able to respond, and where they're at in recovery. We've done that more on a level of 10 scale. So on a scale of 1 to 10, to what extent have you been able to recover? And what are your goals or aspirations for the future? And that's where we get more into this goal for transformation or new ideas. For those of you who are doing a lot of this work, we're incorporating the snowball approach to continue to find additional folks to encourage to engage in this space. So we would conduct interviews first. We're finding themes associated with those interviews. And then we move into our foresight and tabletop discussions. These are typically 3 hours in length. They're really brief compared to what many tabletop scenarios or simulations might be. And that's intentional because we want people to think kind of fast and really reflect on what's happening. And then later in the process, we may bring back a more in-depth scenario, and I'll share that example for some work we did in South Carolina. But in essence, the Foresight Focus Group is intended to be and help participants think through future shocks based on lessons from the past, so we can identify those strategies moving forward. We'd have guided questions on, again, using this flooding scenario, impacts on business and community, perceived recovery, and what went well. The nice part about the focus groups that are different than the interviews is people will bounce back and forth and share nuance and specifics that they may have experienced. We've also done this as a collective group with diverse partners. So maybe we have extension, emergency management, farmers, and businesses all around the table. We've also done it where it's just farmers talking about it. So depending on the dynamics and trust of the space, that might ebb and flow. But it's really helpful to have folks be able to share their experiences and even push back on one another, so we can start to realize too, perhaps one side of the city was getting a different response than a different area, or there was I don't know, something impacted the ability for recovery. So those are the types of conversations that have spurred in that room. We follow that brainstorm and discussion with a tabletop scenario. And this is where we would continue to use that disaster specific, so flooding in this case. And we'd really focus on preparedness and response. We wouldn't quite get to the recovery elements, but we're focusing more on, if this scenario is going to occur, we give them prompts for 2 weeks out, 2 days, the event hits, and then post-crisis, what are they doing right away? And I'll share a specific example here in a little bit too. And again, this tabletop scenario, we've done it a few different ways. One where we've split up the room. So we've had dairy farmers at one table, fruit and vegetable farmers at a different, and then support agencies like food hubs or nonprofits, food access groups. And so the 3 would go through the exercise at the same time. And then we reflect and do that hot wash after together, And we can start to then piece how things might work better next time if in that preparedness stage. So after we've done those qualitative research methods and have aggregated some secondary information on that food system framework, we pull that into both an assessment and snapshot. So these are just a couple examples of that final output. These are also used to share with communities prior to the action planning. So the intent is that we'll be able to determine what we want to do next because of this information. So this is an example then of the action planning that follows. We've used two different practices, one being the typical sticky dot method, and the other being that folks actually vote on different projects ideas based on feasibility, values, and impact. So what you're seeing on the screen on the right is a listing of suggested priorities based on that assessment and process. The community members in the room discuss if those are appropriate and how relevant they are. And then, depending on scope and again, the influence in the room, different dynamics, we may do a voting practice electronically where people can share how feasible a project is, the impact it'll have on their community, and the values it takes. Um, or the sticky dot exercise where people get three sticky dots and they prioritize by vote which ones they would like to have happen. The second piece then with this is after they've determined their priority, we discuss how and who will help implement it. So I mentioned in our program that just wrapped up, we had funding for the project implementation. So in that case, we were both trying to understand how much of that project could be done within that $22,000, but also which organization had capacity to take that on. So the two examples you're seeing on this screen are actually two that were from the first phase. So these had $10,000 to implement a project. One was Texas Center for Local Food. They decided to do two things. One, create a more thorough scenario planning for farmers and food businesses. So we did in-depth, I think it was a 3-hour facilitated session, and then they had a few other network meetings with farmers to create that contact list as well as an emergency management plan. And then the second one was with the Virgin Islands Good Food Coalition. They had done a few different things because of our phases of work, and I'm happy to talk through this in more detail because we've been working with them since 2017. But one example is they created a disaster preparedness checklist for farmers and things that farms could be doing to prep before a hurricane hit. The other thing they did in this case through their prioritization process is they did a food business um, cooperative assessment. They had had a food business cooperative that had been in the community for a few years and had closed. And part of the resilience strategy that came up for them was really having a more collective business again to support farmers, find new markets, and that was their resilience strategy. So they did a follow-up, an investigation on why that business had closed and the opportunities for the future. So you can see that it's again based in the community members, the place itself, and there's a very broad range of what can happen to move these things forward. I'm going to continue now and just share a little bit about each of our case studies. So on the screen, you can see the 8 communities that we've worked with. I tried to identify these as in time frame. So the ones in the red stars, we worked with from 2020 to 2022. And the intent here was to identify locations that had been impacted by different types of disaster. They also all were a part of some of our local food leader and community food systems programs. So there was some baseline understanding and relationship that we had with those communities. This last 3 we worked with from 2023 through 2025. They were all new communities, but they had experienced also some more relevant and recent disasters. So I'll go through these in order. And again, please, if you're in one of these communities or have additions, like feel free to chime in or put this in the chat. So in Alaska, we worked in the Kenai Peninsula and we're trying to understand the Swan Lake fire. I should also say too, for these first five, we looked at COVID as well, which was a big impact to see the compounding effects that COVID and natural disasters were having in communities. So within the Swan Lake fire, it closed down the one road system that came into the Kenai, and so we worked with Alaska Food Policy Council and Home or Soil and Water, as well as the University of Alaska Extension and Outreach. Predominantly during this, we did run into COVID and some shutdowns even while we were in the space. So we had a little bit lower rate of participation, but we were able to do a couple focus groups and interviews and then a survey across Homer. In Arkansas, we worked in Benton and Washington counties with the University of Arkansas Extension and Outreach. This was a little bit broader. We ended up through interviews focusing more on just climate shifts and horticulture practices that were changing based on weather patterns. But they had a very strong survey response rate, and we ended up in this case the priority was around farm to school distribution and figuring out ways of again from that economic side supporting those businesses. In Iowa, our partner was in Marshall County. This one was unique because there was a tornado that had gone through Marshall County, followed by COVID, followed by a derecho. And so we did quite a few interviews and focus and then smaller focus groups. But the thing that was, I think, really fascinating here is we initially thought it would be a very agricultural production implementation strategy, but it ended up being food access. So this group ended up doing little free food libraries across their county, and that program continues to exist and has evolved since then. In Texas, we worked in Bastrop County. I mentioned them a little earlier with Texas Center for Local Foods. They focused on the Lost Pines fire of 2011, which was just a very extreme event. And a lot of trauma came up through those interviews. So I think one thing we learned too is just like having that mental health and understanding of trainings that might be helpful prior to doing interviews in a traumatic space like that would be beneficial. The other thing that happened in Texas was the Winter Storm Uri. I think that's the name of it. I might be saying it wrong, but a winter storm that shut down the power grid across Austin and impacted the surrounding communities too. So we pivoted a little bit in our process to make sure we were asking questions about those things because they were seeing some pretty extreme weather pattern shift as well. And that was the previous project I shared where they wanted to focus on the farmer specific plans that could occur to be able to prepare for those instances, but also recover or respond differently next time. One piece specifically that came up as an example there was communication and not having bilingual and multilingual communication aspects when the winter storm shut down power and where people could go for safe shelter and those types of things. So that also got included in some of the programming. And then the last one from 2022 was the US Virgin Islands. As I mentioned, we had worked with them since 2017, but we were really focused on how continue to build resilience in the community could occur. So this looked at Hurricane Irma and Maria. The thing that's not listed on this page that they also had additional funding for was a consumer survey. So they had a really great response rate to understand consumer preferences in purchasing habits and how that also informs the resilience of a food system. So who's showing up to purchase the food that's being grown locally and regionally and the potential for that market shift to support that business option. And then our last three, and these are some of the case studies that I'll share here coming up. We worked in Kittitas County, Washington with the chamber, and this was unique. It was looking more at the smoke damage that was occurring in the production fields, as well as some transitions from workforce development. And so the intervention here was to create a skill building center to support new and beginning not only farmers, but folks that could support some of the broader agricultural industries like hay production or fruit and veg processing. And so that is still underway, and they're looking at some great opportunities to build out that type of center. In South Carolina, we worked with Live Well Greenville in Greenville County, really focused on the tropical storm Helene. However, while we were doing the follow-up focus groups and some of their intervention too, the fire that had gone through that area was also starting to impact some of the work. So I think the thing we've noticed is there's always a new thing coming, which I'm sure people on this call can relate to. And so how do we continue to adapt and support each other through that work? I'll have an example of their project here in the next slide. And then the last project that we just wrapped up too was with Northeast Kingdom, Vermont, and they experienced cyclical flooding for a couple years and then actually had droughts this last summer too. So a really unique experience. Some farms had to close. Farms were looking at pivoting where their land was. There was a lot of activity and activization of funding practices, but many farms still couldn't recover, respond as quickly as they needed. So I'll use that as my shift to this next page, which is what they prioritize. We worked with NOFA Vermont for their implementation project, and they had 26 farms across the Northeast Kingdom meet for 3 different cohort sessions. Really, the goal was around figuring out how to do a resilience farm fund. So when a disaster strikes, there would be a funding mechanism for those farms to respond and recover faster. From feedback from farmers, they did 3 different sessions. They had a farm resilience, or excuse me, farm financial resilience cohort, a social resilience, and then an ecological resilience. And they partnered with 3 different farms across the region. So they were able to do site visits. The funding went to support time, but also travel and food for those discussions. Um, Nova Vermont is moving forward with this in another area of Vermont too. So that's an exciting outcome that they'll continue to work on how farms can be more resilient in the face of these weather changes. Greenville County, South Carolina. As I mentioned, we worked with Live Well Greenville, but also had some really strong participation from emergency management there. So the county emergency manager helped us create an emergency food response directory, but we also created an emergency food response plan. So the way this was implemented is we had, I think it was 3 or 4 additional sessions. You can see some of the partners on the screen, but really looked at the relationships and intersections of families needing food access post disaster and the distributors that could support that. And part of what they found during Hurricane Helene was that some individuals and families might be stuck in their homes or unable to get to even out of their house in general, but also find culturally relevant, nutritious food. And so we were able to connect with different agencies that were doing meal programs like churches or nonprofits, food hubs, different grocers, and start to consider who would be able to stand up a feeding strategy, a food response plan across the county. And so part of this strategy was Greenville County Emergency Management helped develop a really specific um, scenario that we were able to then test out with the organizations. So the first meeting, we kind of got the scaffolding involved of who does what. And then the last meeting, we were able to go through a 3-hour scenario of testing the proposed call tree and plan with them. So we still used that tropical storm Imelda that you see as that real life simulation in the bottom bullet to understand the things that would need to occur and who was leading which aspects. We even got down to the frequency and times of meetings during an event. Um, I'm going to pause here. I would love to open it up for questions now. My next slides are more specifics on the tools. So does anyone have questions or comments about process, about community findings, or anything like that while we're in this space?
Don't be shy. Just ask good questions.
Comments are welcome too. If you have your own experience in this space, like, we'd love to hear. Yes, Karen, thank you.
So I was just wondering if there was any different methods for advertising these programs to get the various groups to attend. So basically, like, was there a difference in the structure between each of the locations on how the program was advertised and organized?
Awesome question. Yes. Yes, there were, and there are much smarter people that have figured that out than me. So in South Carolina, Susan was amazing at doing personal outreach. She sent emails. They'd also just gone through the tropical storm, so there were a lot of relationships developed through that. But I would say there was that one-on-one connection and outreach. Part of our program is we develop a template flyer and some marketing materials. So that is something we do that can then be posted on like social media, through email, through listservs, and those things. But I think what we've found is that personal connection is probably the strongest. We've also done some press releases in Marshall County, for example. We had a news channel pick it up, and um, they did some promotion for us when we were getting into the strategy of the little free food libraries, and they helped share the word out. I think we had 40 to 50 people at a library to learn more about that program. So those were some success options. Cool. Okay, I'll dig into
I
the
do
weeds
have,
on
oh,
these. Oh, please keep going.
no, no, it's an excellent presentation, and I have a million questions, but I can't quite get to all of them. Neither could you. But thank you so much for this. I do have one question about the food selection for the food libraries. Is Was there a lot of conversation or discussion about culturally relevant foods for the groups that you were serving?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, there was some really strong conversation about that. I think the challenge we ran into was food safety and what we could put in a little free food library. In this case, they were just outside. There wasn't any temp control, so it was more shelf-stable foods. In some cases, they were adjacent to a community or demonstration garden, so there would be some fresh foods available that could perhaps tailor more to culturally relevant products. Um, that being said, as an aside, I think there's been some really strong programs starting with community fridges that might allow for that to occur in a stronger way. To your point, to find additional products that could be stored longer, that weren't your typical like canned goods or dried goods that would go into the library.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, I'll dive into these tools. This is kind of the dry part, but in past presentations, it's been requested to know some of the types of questions we ask. So I'm gonna go through this. These are abbreviated a bit. So if anyone is interested in like the full script or prompts for interviews, focus groups, tabletops, please email me. I'm happy to share this. So I mentioned in brief what this would look like, but wanted to provide more. So in the interviews, we're typically doing those in person and also including a site visit. But when something like COVID occurred, we pivoted that to a virtual option. But the main questions we're asking again are broadly, tell us about your organization and agency or business. Describe the community you work with. The reason we leave that broad is we're really curious and listening for different choice of words, like how people are describing where they work or live, prompts that we might come up with there, or challenges like what do you think the best parts are? What are the worst parts? And we want to get into some of those nuances. We then ask them to focus on their business and interactions in the community. And so we broadly ask them to tell us about their food system. So prompts there might be, do you think your neighbor has access to food? Are they able to find their culturally appropriate foods that they and their family are wanting to eat. Does everyone have affordable options? Are people choosing local and regional? Some of those things. We also ask about community-based development. So are we seeing interactions or activity around collective projects or farm to school efforts or different networks that are spurring up in this space? After we have that foundation, we move into how the specific event impacted their business. So in this case, let's say we're talking about a tornado, we'd ask how the tornado impacted their business. That leads to a whole slew of different questions about how they needed to respond, how they're recovering, what needs they still have. And we also ask about the ability for them to rebuild and challenges there. The one piece that's not on here too is we've asked about organizations that have supported them, and that's been a key piece of our interest is that social capital fabric. And so that's been a question too. Oh, thank you for the comment, Kitty, about the additional needs. That's really great. Our foresight focus group, again, is usually about an hour, hour and a half, depending on the size of the group. The way we've formatted this is I'm going to keep using the tornado example now. So this would be a collective group. If it's this size here, I would put people in smaller groups. But first, we're going to have everyone share about their experience of that tornado relating to food systems, how it impacted you in your work. I do not force people to talk. We do set ground rules for this in terms of being respectful to one another, using I statements, what's said in the room stays in the room type of thing. But it's not a round robin, if you will. It's really meant to build on what folks are saying. I have encouraged, if you find there's very quiet people, I have encouraged folks to write down responses if they're not comfortable sharing verbally, and then it's still included in our coding and information in the toolkit, or excuse me, in the assessment. We ask about what impacts community-wide folks experience from a tornado and in what ways they feel they've recovered. After we get that kind of foundational level, then I move into some of the foresight questions. So I would preface it with when that tornado occurred and how it had impacted their community, and then ask them to first start about what went right in that tornado response or recovery. And that's really helpful to start in a positive light because it's very easy for folks to talk about what went wrong. So we first talk about what went right, and then we move into what did not go correctly, what needs to change for the future, what didn't work. A little bit of a tricky part in here is people will call out specific organizations or individuals, especially when it's like very close to that time frame. So I would say there can be some conflict management at work there. Then we move into what we want to do next because of this. So knowing what we know now about that tornado impact and how we responded, what do we need to do to be more responsive in the future? We then talk too about like who needs to be engaged in that response effort or recovery effort. This gets a little bit into the organizational structure. A lot of times folks are just brainstorming everyone under the sun that they really think needs to be there. We have had a few folks say like this organization needs to step back in this space too, though, because perhaps they didn't respond effectively. So that is the essence of the foresight focus group. We get a break, and then we move into the tabletop exercise. So I'm just going to roll through this example quick. This was modeled for the flooding incident in Vermont. We just used this a couple months ago, actually, in a presentation, but it comes from the North Carolina Drinking Water Incident Response Toolkit as a precedent, which was really, really helpful. So we set the stage of where we're at in terms of creeks and rivers being at capacity. We're expecting the additional rainfall. And then the first inject is that at 7:30 a.m. on Tuesday, we received that notification that your community has been placed under a flood watch for the next 48 hours. This is where I might have folks separate depending on the number of people, but also the types of businesses or organizations that are in the room. I find it really helpful. Sometimes if farmers can be together, they just think about their sites in a more strategic way than someone who's not a farmer. And similarly, support agencies, land grants, universities could be at their own. I say that, and it's also really nice to have a diverse table too, so you can kind of bounce back and forth. But depending on how specific you want to get, it's nice to separate them out. In either case, they would go through these prompts, but it always takes its own tailspin. So the prompts we give them at least are like, what are you doing on your site to prepare? Who do you need to connect with? What organizations or groups need to be activated? And is there a plan for harvesting or moving product, livestock, etc.? I give them a very short time frame, like 7 minutes, and I'm just yelling at them constantly. It's been my route. It feels very alarming, and that is the point. And we preface that in the beginning that they're going to be annoyed, in this case with me, for yelling at them and making them move too fast. But the goal isn't that they're going to resolve or make decisions from this. It's really to get the blood flowing. So the second inject then is that we're now at 8 a.m. on Thursday. We received 10 inches of rain. Rivers have breached. We are losing power. Generators are running out of fuel. There's also issues with some private drinking wells. So now we're talking about what are you doing on site to respond? Who do we need to check in on? Are we evacuating? What areas of concern? And hopefully at this point, because of the pre-question, they're moving into the next steps of that. Those are the first two, or the main two that we've done, and then we have an initial post-event inject. So this one is an additional 5 inches of rain occurred. My timing is off on this slide, but the rain has subsided and there's standing water that's starting to recede. Residents, farmers, and businesses are able to get back to their site. So the main question we want folks thinking about here is, what are the first things you're checking on? And this one's helpful because then we can talk about how to do that safely. Do you have plans or procedures for drinking water post-incident? How are you getting that? And then which agencies and organizations are going to help you coordinate to recover as soon as possible? So we do those, and then typically we do a round robin where everyone shares about their discussion. So I like a question about like, what were you surprised about, or was there an aha moment from your discussion? Did you learn something new that gets shared with the large group? And then we also, as we're doing updates from each, let's say we have 3 different breakouts and they're each sharing, we can start to showcase how those intersections could occur. So if a food hub was planning how to move food, and a farmer needs to harvest and get food moved as well, we can begin to think about how they might sync up and do that. Let's skip these. I think I'm not going to read these whole slides because they're very wordy, but the main thing I wanted to just share in general, and then I'm going to wrap up and we can have discussion, is the piece that we found kind of across communities is the importance of that framework and understanding across our community assets and our food systems lens, that they all impact each other, and that there's different levels of like resilience and adaptive capacity that show up based on those relationships and understanding. The community capitals, or our asset areas that I think have been most strongly influenced the ability to move faster, was social capital, and having those relationships ahead of time, having strong built infrastructure and natural infrastructure environment, knowing how those systems intersect and where the impact is going to occur, really overlapped across the threshold. I think the other piece that has just continued to come up is the role we have in extension in this space, and realizing that we all have different organizational capacity, interest, ability in each of our states too. And there's also a lack of awareness, at least in the communities we've worked with, about our role in that space. So continuing to build those relationships with not only our food systems partners, but our emergency management partners at the local, state, and federal level, I think will continue to make us more stronger in the future. With that, I just wanted to share food for thought. If you're interested or want to know more, we do have a resilient food systems certification. We are building a toolkit of different resources too, of some of the things I just shared, but that will be coming out soon. And I am happy to have conversation here or open it up. My contact information is on the slide, and I just gave a couple different links to some of our resource pages.
Courtney, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. Lots of great information. Now, who has other information or questions or whatever for Courtney? And while you're thinking of those, Reagan just put, I think, the evaluation link in the chat. Make sure that you fill that out again. We all know how important those are. And is there anything else that anybody else would like to mention? We are next month. Let me find my sheet so I can tell you who's going to be up before we get off of here. So March 10th, put it on your calendar. Probably already is. Dallas Douglas Casa, he's a chief executive officer for Corey Stringer Institute, University of Connecticut, and he's going to do a presentation on laboring safely in the heat, considerations for yourself, your staff, and those you educate. So in some parts of our state, in our nation, it doesn't take very long to get to that point where, we need to be considering those sort of things. So make sure that you join us again for that. This is recorded, and you'll get the notice on the recording in a day or two, and then you can, again, review it again or whatever, and hopefully, you'll have some good thoughts for Courtney. Reagan, what did you put in here? Did you put something else in?
Yeah, so you all on this call are really special. You're the first in the network to hear about the new sign up for February through December of this year for all the webinars. So the links that you have in your calendars for March, April, May will just need to be deleted, and you will get an opportunity to sign up. This just sort of allows us to clean out the registration. We have over 400 people registered for these webinars, but you guys did it back in January of last year, so we just need to clean that up a little bit, and then you can just sign up and for fresh. And it's okay if you can't make it to all the webinars that you sign up for. It's really okay, but it's best to get it on your calendar so that you know it's there and it's a good reminder. But let me
So
know.
Reagan, you'll send out an email to that effect or whatever, so that people know what to
There
do.
will be lots of promotion about this, but I just wanted to share it during this webinar today that if you want to come to the February 1 and on, you'll need to sign up again.
Okay.
And I put the link in.
All right. Thank you very much for doing that. So, anyone else have anything that they would like to mention? And if any of you have a webinar that you would like to share with us, get hold of the PD committee, and we're always looking for some. We've got a few of them on the list right now, but we always want to be working ahead. So, I know that many of you have presentations that would fit right in. So please, if you decide to do that, we're always open for that.
I realized too, I didn't respond well to Kitty's comment in the chat, and just I was acknowledging like, yes, so important. And I think the piece that came up in a few of our communities, specifically Greenville, because they had so many individuals and households impacted, was linking up with your food safety specialists and having perhaps some trainings or best practices ready to go to hand out next time. And then I think on storing diabetes or those pieces, it's a great question of figuring out how to what's the generator, what are the refrigeration options. Things got really warm. So I think all good questions, but I would
Yeah.
lean into the food safety side.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, definitely. Because we have like a food safety specialist and we're trying to get more. But yeah, I think my biggest thing was just educating the public, because if people aren't aware, then they may not be aware that there's even a risk to their water safety, or may not be aware that their diabetes medication is no longer usable. And then they'll continue using it, which puts people at future risk of health related conditions. And so I think just like educating the public, like, did you know that, like, check, like, if your diabetes medication was not stored, like, you should throw it away. You should immediately like contact your doctor to get it refilled. Things like that.
Good points. Very good points.
But yes, just a wonderful, wonderful presentation. I'm excited to kind of engage with the resources that you have available. Living and working in California, we definitely are having a lot of these concerns, from flooding to fires, and sometimes in the same location in the same year. It's great.
Exactly. I know, kind of amazing. So again, thank you, Courtney, for your presentation. It was well done, very well done. Great information. And I know that this group will get a lot of information out of it, and others will as well. So until next month, and remember to sign up. Until next month, we'll just close it down for today. Thank you.